For 6 years, I paid for my son's entire life, his mortgage, his bills, his wife's lavish parties. But the moment I needed care after my surgery, they decided I was a burden. They isolated me, tricked me into signing away my rights while I was on medication, and handed me a brochure for a nursing home. They thought I was just a frail, old woman they could discard. But they forgot I was a bank manager for 40 years, and their living trust fund was about to call in its debt with interest. For the first week after my hip surgery, I almost believed their performance. The house, my son Will's house that I'd been paying for going on 6 years, had never looked more beautiful. It was the day of Steph's big charity luncheon, and she'd filled every room with white hydrangeas that must have cost a fortune. I was set up in a comfortable armchair by the bay window, a perfect vantage point to watch my daughter-in-law play the role of a lifetime, the doting, selfless caregiver. She would glide across the room, her smile as bright and hard as the diamonds on her wrist, to fluff my pillow or adjust the blanket on my lap. She'd bring me a cup of tea, her voice dripping with concern, asking if I was in any pain, but her eyes would be darting over my shoulder, scanning the room. I saw the way she'd steer our neighbors, the Parkers, away from me when they tried to settle in for a real chat. She'd laugh and say she didn't want them tiring me out, but I could feel the tension radiating from her. It was a strange, frantic energy, like she was afraid I might say the wrong thing. I was just an accessory, a prop, in the meticulously staged play of her perfect Westchester life. In the days that followed, the performance became more suffocating. The guests were gone, but the surveillance intensified. My life, once my own, was suddenly curated. Steph decided I needed to be protected from stress, which apparently included my own friends. When my friend Linda called, Will would answer my phone and politely explain that I was resting and couldn't be disturbed. Visitors were told I wasn't feeling up to company. They framed it as love, as this overwhelming concern for my recovery, but it felt like the walls were slowly closing in. I was being isolated, cut off from my own life under the guise of care. They were managing me, and in my post-surgical fog, I didn't have the strength to fight back. I just told myself it was temporary, that they were just worried. It's amazing what you'll let yourself believe when the truth is too ugly to consider. The moment it all happened, the real betrayal was so mundane, I almost don't remember it. It was a Tuesday morning, and the pain medication had left me feeling like my head was wrapped in cotton. Steph came into my room with a cheerful smile and a thick stack of papers. She said they were just routine insurance and Medicare forms from the hospital, things that needed to be signed so they could handle the billing. She spread them out on the blanket, pointing with a perfectly manicured finger. She told me not to worry my head about the fine print, that it was all standard procedure. I remember the pen feeling heavy in my hand, the letters on the page blurring slightly. I trusted her. Why wouldn't I? She was my son's wife, my family. So I signed where she told me to, my signature a little shaky on each line. It felt like a simple chore, a bit of administrative nonsense to get out of the way. I had no idea I had just signed away my entire life. Then came the night I couldn't sleep. The pain in my hip had subsided to a dull, throbbing ache, and the silence of the big house was pressing down on me. Around 2 a.m, I heard a floorboard creak in the hallway. It was Will. His voice was a low, desperate whisper, nothing like his usual confident tone. He was on the phone, and the panic in his voice sliced right through the quiet of the house. He was talking about the bank, about something called a HELOC, a home equity line of credit. I heard him say the bank had called again, and that if they didn't get the house listed for sale by the first of the month, the bank was going to call the note. A cold dread washed over me, a chilling clarity, that cut through any lingering fog from my medication. And then he said the words that stopped my heart. I heard him whisper frantically to Steph on the other end of the line, his voice cracking. He said he didn't know what to tell me, that I still thought they were just paying the mortgage. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now, let's get back to it. I lay there in the dark for what must have been hours, my son's whispered words echoing in the silence. The shock felt like a physical blow, a cold weight settling deep in my chest. But as the initial horror subsided, something else began to stir. It was an old, familiar feeling, a cold anger that burned away the fog of grief and medication. For 40 years, I was a bank manager. My entire life was spent assessing risk, reading the fine print, and understanding the patterns of desperation. And as I lay there in the house, I paid for a prisoner in my own life. The retiree faded away, and the bank manager took over. I wasn't just a mother betrayed. I was an investor whose primary asset had turned toxic. And I knew exactly what to do when that happens. You liquidate. By the time the sun came up, I had a plan. The next morning, I allowed Will to help me to the breakfast table, playing the part of the frail, recovering mother. Steph was already there, a whirlwind of false cheerfulness, talking about the perfect weather and the garden club. I watched them over the rim of my teacup. Will wouldn't meet my eyes, focusing intently on spreading jam on his toast. Steph kept glancing at me, her smile stretched just a little too tight. They were nervous. Good. I took a slow sip of tea, let the silence hang in the air for a moment, and then I made my first move. I looked at my son, my voice soft and laced with a hint of nostalgia. I told him I'd been thinking about my old financial advisor, Mr. Abernathy, and that I wanted to discuss restructuring my bond portfolio. I asked if he could please get him on the line for me. It was a simple, innocent-sounding question, except I knew perfectly well that Mr. Abernathy had retired to Florida 5 years ago. The effect was immediate and deeply satisfying. Steph, who was halfway through pouring herself more coffee, flinched so hard the pot clattered against her cup. She shot a panicked look at Will, her eyes wide. Before Will could even process the question, she jumped in her voice a little too loud, a little too sharp. She said that Mr. Abernathy was long gone, had been for years, and that she was handling all my financial communications now just to keep things simple for me. Will, caught completely off guard, just sort of mumbled his agreement, looking from his wife to me like a terrified spectator at a tennis match. Their stories weren't aligned. Their panic was clumsy and obvious. They weren't masterminds. They were amateurs. And in that moment, I knew I had them. My physical therapist, a kind young woman named Chloe, came that afternoon. It was the perfect opportunity. As she was helping me with my exercises, I began to complain about my phone, saying the screen was too small for my eyes and the buttons were too confusing. I put on a whole performance of the helpless, technologically inept senior, and she fell for it completely. I asked her if she could possibly help me set up a new, simpler smartphone one I'd ordered online. She was happy to help, of course. While she was busy transferring my contacts, I asked her to add one more number, reading it from an old piece of paper I'd kept in my wallet. Once she was done and had left the room to get me a glass of water, I made my move. My hands were shaking, but my mind was clear. I made one call. It was brief. I told my old friend and lawyer David that my family had fraudulently obtained my power of attorney and that I needed his help immediately. Perhaps they sensed the shift in the air. Maybe my question at breakfast had spooked them more than I realized. Whatever the reason, the atmosphere in the house changed that evening. The facade of loving care evaporated replaced by a cold, impatient tension. The pretense was over. As Steph cleared the dinner plates, she didn't even bother to look at me. She just announced to the room that she had scheduled an assessment for the following week. She said a moi care consultant was coming to determine my needs and find a suitable long-term facility. She didn't ask, she informed. It was no longer a suggestion or a worry. It was a decision that had been made. The threat was now out in the open, hanging in the air between us. They were done waiting. They were ready to cash in their investment. When Steph made her announcement about the care consultant, I saw the triumphant gleam in her eye. She expected me to argue, to cry, to fight back. That's what the old Marion would have done. But the new Marion, the one born from the cold shock of betrayal, knew that a strategic retreat is not a surrender. So I gave them exactly what they wanted. I let my shoulders slump. I allowed a look of confused fear to cross my face. In the days leading up to the consultant's visit, I became the picture of a deteriorating old woman. I'd forget things, mid-sentence ask the same question twice. I let my hand tremble when I reached for my water glass. Their relief was palpable. They saw my quiet submission as a victory, a sign that my spirit was finally broken. Their arrogance grew with each passing day, and with it their carelessness. They started leaving financial statements out on the kitchen counter, speaking more freely in the next room, certain I was too deaf or too senile to understand. Their carelessness gave me the confirmation I needed. One evening, while fetching myself a glass of water, I saw a crumpled piece of official-looking paper in the kitchen trash peeking out from under some coffee grounds. My heart pounded as I smoothed it out on the counter. It was a final notice from the bank addressed to William and Stephanie Foster. The words were stark and brutal. Foreclosure auction scheduled. It was for the home equity line of credit, the HELOC my son had whispered about in that panicked phone call. The amount owed was staggering enough to make my breath catch in my throat. This wasn't just about keeping up with the neighbors. This was about staving off complete and utter financial ruin. They weren't just trying to get rid of me. They were trying to liquidate their last asset to plug a hole in a sinking ship. They saw my removal not just as a convenience, but as a necessary evil for their own survival. My afternoon naps became my war room. With my secret phone clutched under the covers, I was no longer a frail patient. I was a commander, directing my only field operative. My texts to David were short-coded and precise. I told him to confirm the filing of the power of attorney. He replied within an hour that it was on record filed the day after I signed it. I instructed him to begin preparing the legal challenge to have it rescinded on grounds of fraud and my impaired state. My next instruction was the most important I needed: a full accounting. I directed him to start gathering every piece of financial documentation he could find for the last 6 years. Every mortgage payment I'd made, every property tax bill, every utility, every check I'd written for their groceries and their country club dues. I was building my case brick by painful brick. Each text I sent was a small act of rebellion, a quiet reclaiming of the power they thought they had stolen. The night before the consultant was scheduled to arrive, I found the final piece of their contempt sitting on my nightstand. It was a glossy, tri-fold brochure for a place called Maple Creek Senior Residence. The pictures showed smiling, vacant-eyed residents sitting in sterile common rooms. It looked less like a home and more like an expensive prison. Tucked inside was a handwritten note from Steph, written in her perfect loopy cursive on thick, creamy stationery. It said she knew I would be so much happier there and that they could visit me every Sunday. I picked up the brochure, feeling the weight of her condescension, her absolute certainty that she had won. I didn't feel anger or sadness. I felt a profound, cold calm. She had just handed me another piece of evidence. I placed it carefully in my drawer with the crumpled foreclosure notice. The case against them was almost complete. I sat in my armchair, the one by the window, and folded my hands in my lap. I was playing the part of the docile elder ready for assessment. The care consultant, a woman named Mrs. Gable with a clipboard and a professionally sympathetic smile, had just begun. She was asking me patronizing questions in a loud, slow voice, asking if I knew what day it was, if I had trouble remembering to take my medication. Steph stood behind her, a smug, proprietary look on her face, while Will hovered nervously by the door. I was giving them all the answers they expected, nodding and looking confused when the doorbell rang. Its chime cut through the quiet room like a starter pistol. Will went to answer it, and a moment later, my lawyer David walked into the room. He was the complete opposite of Mrs. Gable, where she was soft and condescending. He was sharp-tailored and radiated an aura of absolute lethal competence. He wasn't there for a social call. He nodded once to me, then turned to Will and Steph. He didn't raise his voice. He simply opened his leather briefcase and handed them each a sheaf of papers. I heard him say the words clearly, a beautiful, precise incision into their smug little world. He informed them they were being served with a temporary restraining order and a notice of legal action to rescind a fraudulently obtained power of attorney. The carefully constructed facade of their lives didn't just crack, it exploded. Steph stared at the papers in her hand as if they were venomous snakes. David, wasting no time, produced a second document from his briefcase. It was a copy of a bank statement. He laid it on the coffee table, and I could see the incriminating letterhead from across the room. It was the statement for their secret home equity line of credit. That's what it took. Steph let out a sound that was half sob, half scream, and the confession came pouring out of her. It was a tidal wave of desperation and rage. She talked about the crushing debt, the country club membership, they couldn't afford the lease on the luxury car. She screamed about the shame of living a lie, of feeling like an imposter among their wealthy friends. And then she turned on my son, her face twisted with a resentment so deep it was shocking. She blamed him, his inadequacy, his inability to earn the kind of money that would give her the life she felt she deserved. The whole ugly, desperate truth of their hidden history was laid bare right there on the expensive Oriental rug. The implosion was immediate. Will, who had been standing there, white-faced and silent, finally broke. His wife had just publicly emasculated him, confessing their shared failure and pinning it all on him. The shock on his face curdled into a bitter fury. He started shouting back at her, blaming her insatiable appetite for things they couldn't afford, her obsession with status that had driven them into this hole. Their conspiracy, their united front against me, dissolved into a flurry of vicious, hateful accusations. They were tearing each other apart, revealing every secret, every weakness. In the middle of this domestic firestorm, Mrs. Gable, the care consultant, quietly gathered her clipboard and her purse. I saw the look on her face, a mixture of professional horror and a desperate desire to be anywhere else. She muttered something about rescheduling and practically fled the house, the front door clicking shut behind her. She was a witness to the truth now, and the truth was messy. I waited until their shouting had subsided into ragged, exhausted sobs. They stood on opposite sides of the room, two people who had just destroyed each other. I had been silent the entire time, just watching, a quiet spectator to the demolition of my son's life. Then I cleared my throat. The small sound cut through the tense silence, and they both flinched and looked at me, their eyes wide with a new kind of fear. I was no longer the frail, confused woman in the armchair. I looked directly at David, my voice as calm and steady as a surgeon's hand. I instructed him to please inform my son and his wife that as of that morning, a lien had been placed against the house for the full $327,000 I had invested in it. I told them they would not be selling it. I let that sink in, watching the last bit of hope drain from their faces. Then I delivered the final blow. I told them that now we could discuss my moving timeline. My moving timeline, as it turned out, was swift. David handled the logistics, and within 2 days, I was gone. But I had one final piece of business to conduct. The true resolution couldn't happen in that house, a place of domestic drama and messy emotions. It had to happen on my turf, in a place where feelings are irrelevant and only numbers matter. I had David arrange a meeting at my old bank, in a sterile conference room with polished wood and tinted windows. I had him summon Will and Steph under the guise of resolving the estate issues, a phrase official sounding enough to terrify them into compliance. They arrived looking pale and diminished, their marital strife having curdled into a shared sullen dread. They sat on one side of the long table. I sat on the other with David at my right hand and the bank manager, a man I'd known for 30 years, at the head. This was not a family meeting, it was an audit. I let David begin. With the calm, dispassionate air of a seasoned lawyer, he presented the legal findings. He spoke of the fraudulent power of attorney obtained while I was impaired and medicated. He spoke of the secret home equity line of credit, an act of loan fraud committed using an asset I was actively maintaining. He laid out the clear grounds for both civil and criminal charges. Will shrank in his chair, looking at his hands. Steph just stared at the polished surface of the table, her face a blank mask. Then it was my turn. I didn't raise my voice. I simply opened a binder I had prepared. Inside were spreadsheets meticulously organized by year. I walked them through it page by page. 6 years of their lives quantified in black and white. The mortgage payments, all 72 of them. The property taxes, the utility bills, the country club dues, the insurance premiums for their luxury car, the grocery bills. A quiet, systematic presentation of the $327,000 I had poured into their fabricated lifestyle. It was the financial anatomy of their betrayal. When I was finished, a heavy silence filled the room. The judgment, when it came, was not from me. That was the beauty of my plan. The punishment had to come from the very institution they so desperately wanted to impress. The bank manager, who had been listening intently, cleared his throat. He looked at Steph and Will, not with anger, but with a cold, professional disappointment that was far more damning. He spoke of the bank's zero-tolerance policy for fraud. He informed them that pending an internal investigation into the HELOC, all their personal and joint accounts were being frozen effective immediately. He then stated that the full amount of the home equity loan was being called in due in 30 days. It was a complete and total financial execution, delivered not by a scorned mother, but by the dispassionate voice of the system they worshipped. I watched the last bit of color drain from Steph's face. She had built her entire identity on the illusion of wealth and status, and the high priest of that religion had just excommunicated her. That was my cue to leave. The business was concluded. I pushed a final document across the table toward David. It was the paperwork to create an ironclad, irrevocable trust, naming him as the trustee. It would hold all my assets, every penny I had reclaimed, shielding them forever from anyone else's greed. I stood up, my new hip feeling strong and steady beneath me. I looked at my son and his wife one last time, two strangers sitting in the rubble of their own making. I gave them my final statement not with anger, but with the simple finality of a teller closing a window. I told them the arrangement was over, that they wanted to maintain their lifestyle without the burden of having me, and that now they had neither. I signed the trust document with a steady hand, slid it back to David, and walked out of the conference room without a backward glance, leaving them alone to face the banker and the consequences they had created for themselves. The account was finally permanently closed. Walking out of that bank was like taking my first breath after being held underwater for a very long time. I didn't feel triumphant, not in the way you see in movies. I just felt quiet. The storm was over. In the weeks that followed, I didn't have to do anything. The consequences I had set in motion unfolded with the quiet, merciless logic of an avalanche. David kept me informed. A for sale sign went up on the Westchester lawn, but this one was different. It was a foreclosure sign from the bank, a public announcement of their failure. A friend of a friend told me a story she'd heard from the local market. She described seeing Steph at the checkout, her cart piled high with imported cheeses and expensive cuts of meat, a pantomime of a life she no longer lived. She'd watched as Steph's credit cards were declined, one after another, the cashier's polite apologies growing colder with each attempt. A quiet, devastating humiliation played out under the fluorescent lights of a grocery store. The real changes took a little more time. About 6 months after that day at the bank, David gave me the final update. The house was gone, sold at auction for less than they owed. Steffi told me had left Will. She couldn't handle the social freefall, the shame of their new reality. Her love, it turned out, was only collateral on a lifestyle they could no longer afford. And Will. My son was living in a small apartment and working a modest job, the kind he'd probably have had all along if he hadn't been propped up by my money and his wife's ambition. David said he sounded different on the phone, humbled, diminished, a man finally forced to confront the true cost of his own weakness. While their world was shrinking, mine was blossoming. I had moved into a beautiful, accessible apartment in the city with a view of the park and enough sunlight to fill every room. I reconnected with the friends Steph and Will had so carefully edited out of my life. We had long lunches, went to the theater, and talked for hours, picking up right where we had left off. I found that my old life, the one I had before I became their living trust fund, was still there waiting for me. And with David's help, I found a new purpose. I used a portion of the funds I'd reclaimed to establish a small foundation. We provide pro bono legal aid to elderly people who find themselves in situations like the one I just escaped. My pain, my experience was transformed into a shield for others. I was having coffee with David just last week in a little cafe, bathed in the warm afternoon sun. We were finalizing some paperwork for the foundation when he paused, looking at me with a thoughtful expression. He told me something had started happening a month ago. He'd been receiving a small payment every single Friday, transferred directly to the account managing the lien against Will. It wasn't much, but it was consistent. It was a symbolic act, a quiet penance from a son I may never truly speak to again. I didn't know what to feel, so I just nodded, a wave of complex emotion washing over me, a deep sorrow for everything that was lost, but an even deeper peace for everything that had been found. I looked out the window at the bustling city, at the people living their lives, and I felt a profound sense of calm. My life was finally completely my own. It wasn't just reclaimed. It was redesigned, built on a foundation of dignity and independence that no one could ever take from me again. In the end, Marion's story serves as a powerful lesson on the nature of justice and strength. It reminds us that family betrayal often stems not from pure malice, but from a desperate fear of failure. Her son and his wife were not evil. They were weak, terrified of their carefully constructed world falling apart. But Marion's journey shows that understanding the reasons for cruelty does not excuse the act itself. True justice, she discovered, wasn't about revenge, but about reclaiming one's dignity. It was about using the strength and wisdom she had always possessed to build a fortress of independence so strong that no one could ever imprison her again.